Good morning, community, and welcome to another Real Conversations with Dr. Anita. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, and I am so incredibly excited to have with us Dr. Julie Taylor, an Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Cal State University San Bernardino. Got that right this time?
Got it.
Okay, good. Last time we started recording, and all of a sudden the technology kind of went on the fritz on me because we're having a rainstorm right now. But more importantly, I think it might be reacting to the news that we have a new president-elect, Joe Biden. So before we get to the business at hand, can we just kind of like process this for a minute here? It does not seem real, Dr. Julie. How about for you?
It doesn't seem real. I am just really, I think that we've been in a perpetual state of chaos for the last 4 years. And so I feel like there's going to be chaos that's going to ensue, and I'm not sure which way it's going to come from. So I'm really excited, but I'm also, in a sense, cautiously optimistic. Yeah. How are you processing?
You know, it's odd because I did 2 other podcasts this morning. And in the first one, we were talking about the fact that with all the uncertainty with the razor thin margins, that the last update that I had heard was that we might not know the results until after Thanksgiving. Then when we were doing the second show, all of our phones just started blowing up. The results are in, he won, he only needed 270, he got 284. And so we were literally on air as history was in the making.
Wow.
So I'm trying to process that. I'm trying to host a show. I'm trying to ask thoughtful questions. And in the back of my mind going, history is in the making right now. Yeah. And so I see our conversation as very timely and somewhat historical as well, because now we're going to be talking about, how things are going to be shifting in the workplace. So, the monologue for this month was talking about the Survivors Club and how, we're surviving and seeing the scene, what we can visibly see as far as how people are showing up, and surveying the scene, the SCENE, or the landscape, especially in regards to the workplace. And so what I would like to explore with you today is hidden organizations and whether or not or how they can be influenced by truly embracing diversity and inclusion. So with that being said, Dr. Julie, I have a few questions, but for the most part, I just want us to kind of explore this real time together. So my premise is the fact that as a Black woman and other people of color, other marginalized communities, it seems to me, well, it doesn't seem to me, I know that there are hidden organizations in terms of, let's specifically say, human resources, which people are conditioned to. When you have a challenge, when you have an issue, you go there. But in my own experience, it seems as though HR is not always the beginning of the solution for me, and that sometimes I feel like there's a hidden organization at play. What I have come to know as the gaslighting of Black women in corporate America, the language that's used. Well, I'm so disappointed, or you have misunderstood, or however they want to phrase things to make it seem like it's me, and I know it's not. So when I talk about hidden organizations, that's what I'm talking about. How do we identify those, and then how do we interact in those? So let's start there.
Yeah, so this is wonderful. One of my areas of expertise, if we can say that, is hidden organizations. And in communication studies, we talk about hidden organizations more on a macro scale. So looking at things like human trafficking, drug trafficking, those bigger ideas. But what I love in this more applied setting is taking those ideas and looking at how is our communication organizing hidden elements of workspaces. And I think what you're really, I love the idea of, can I trust HR? And no. Why I say no, and sorry to all my HR friends.
Right, I have HR friends too. So let's be clear. We're not bashing HR, but that's typically where we're conditioned to go for help. And oftentimes, HR is really there to protect the organization, not the individual.
That's right. And I think that that's so important. So thinking about structure. So if we have, the reality that systemic racism, sexism, all these different isms exist in the very foundation of organizational structure means that you have to, in a sense, be skeptical of the structure that exists before you. And so
okay, so let me pause you right there. You just said that we have to be skeptical.
Yeah, we do.
So I'm not paranoid. I'm not negative. I'm not trying to place the blame. You're saying we need to be skeptical.
We do.
Okay.
Because, yeah, and if you think about like the bodies of who first was entering organizations, and one of my favorite things about studying organizational communication is the fact that at the center, like the only way that organizations exist is because of people, and understanding that people are inherently flawed and we're only as good as our latest idea, then we should always be in this like growth mindset of like, how do we make organizations better? How do we make sure that they're more inclusive? And I think for a lot of people, they just say, well, this is how it's always been. I hear you, I validate that position, but why is it that way? When was that structure created? What were the ideologies that were present? And why, or what would we want to retain from that period? Like, does it still fit now? And I think for a lot of things, it doesn't. So I think we can, yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Julie, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you a lot, only
Please
because you are making points where I have to say, so it wasn't just me, this is for real. And when you say organizations are flawed because of people and people are flawed, that is the same thing that I always say. So we started off talking about the fact that we've got a new president-elect. And I'm always saying, we can't say that this party is better than that party because both parties are made up of humans and you're dealing with the human element in politics and anywhere you go. Yep. So, you can find folks sleeping with each other's wives on the red side. You can folks sleeping with each other's wives on the blue side because you're dealing with human nature. So back to your point about organizational structures and systems, because we're dealing with flawed people, we're dealing with flawed systems.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. The other part of thinking about HR is HR deals in policy, right? And one of the other parts of my research that I really love is thinking about how is policy created, who authors policy, who has access to be an author, who has access to that type of resource, understanding those policy structures that exist, and then how to get things implemented. It's not typically like people of minority, right? Color, gender, race, sexual orientation, any of those. It's usually people who have always had a seat at the table. And so, yeah.
And so what you say right there to me says hidden organization, simply because of who has access and who does not.
Yeah. No, and I hear how you're saying that. And I love that. I really think that's a really cool place that the academic scholars could go, is saying like, oh, let's talk about the more micro experiences and how they have a macro consequence.
Right. And I want to thank you for clarifying what hidden organizations means at the macro level versus how I'm defining it based on my lived experiences at the micro level. So thank you for that clarification.
Oh, absolutely. But I think that these, policies, I think that we often give a lot of power to policies because we're like, well, it's the rule, it's the law. And it's like, it's the law, again, according to a certain state and time, according to certain authors and their perspectives. And again, they're going to be flawed. So we should be, taking them essentially with a grain of salt, but also importance, but then asking how and in what ways could they be better? And especially something I like to look at is maternity leave. So thinking about even the role of maternity leave, like in some ways that gives, it puts ownership on women, is first of all, in terms of biologically carrying children. But then what happens to dads? What happens if people don't biologically have kids? And so opening up that conversation to be more inclusive of diverse experiences. And maybe something today that we don't necessarily go, whoa, that is new, that's new thought. But at one point in time, it was new thought. And we're asking ourselves, why is maternity leave housed under disability? Like, is pregnancy really a disability? And I think that what we're seeing now is an incredible opportunity to revamp and examine our policies, especially in the workforce, and go, who's really represented here? Or what are the unintended consequences of these policies in under or non-represented populations? And
so when you talk about the fact that women being pregnant is not anything new.
Mhm.
And the policies may be outdated based on where we are now as a society.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a distinction I like to make between new knowledge, KNEW, and new knowledge, NEW, in which the KNEW knowledge is this is how it's always been, but when we apply it differently, it all of a sudden becomes NEW knowledge. Does that make sense?
Oh, that does. That's interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think we're going to see that now. So, for instance, we're seeing that even in Black Lives Matter movement, where people are saying this brutality has always been existing, but now all of a sudden we have technology that is allowing it to become new knowledge to some people,
Right.
and they're like, this isn't existing, right? Because, and I think that for some people, there's a lot of fear wrapped up in that, and there's a lot of guilt and shame of, but it can't be like, there's no way I would support a country that would allow that to happen. And
so when you talk about guilt and shame, that's something that I always start my conversations with as a consultant. I let people know that I never come from a space of, I call it shame and blame. I always want to come from a space of know and grow. And part of know and grow means adopting a growth versus a fixed mindset. So how does that come into play in the discussion that we're having today about hidden organizations is how I've defined them, but now you have clarified that it's about who has access to the power and the policy making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of fixed versus growth mindset is a great question. It, for me, starts in how we learn, how we're taught how to learn. And I think we're taught that there's this finite amount of knowledge and, there's only one way to do something. And that's really not the case. And so fixed mindset means, right, that there's like our abilities are static. So we know what we know, and we can't change out of that. And I think that there's a lot of elements of tradition that are built into that. Like as beautiful as traditions are, they're in some ways they're very static, and so they're fixed. With growth mindset, what we can do is we can approach things, we can approach people, I think most importantly, in the ability to grow. And so as I was thinking about this podcast, I was actually thinking, I asked myself, would I have liked me 20 years ago? Because, I'm like, I don't know that I would have. I always tell my students, when I took my first feminist class, I had a lot of opinions about feminism, but a lot of opinions about feminism from this more fixed mindset because of what I had been told, not because of what I had gone out and researched or thought for myself, but I was just like, oh, these feminists, they are so wrong. And now I teach gender classes, right? So now I am a feminist scholar. And so I love the people who gave me grace to grow, and I love the ability to give myself grace to grow. So I am not who I was 20 years ago, thank goodness. What about you, Dr. Anita? Would you have liked yourself 20 years ago?
I would have thought, who does she think she is? And it's not because I was conceited, but because of my experiences early. People trying to set me aside as early as the second grade, when my second grade teacher tried to tell my mom that I didn't belong in the class. And at that time, for whatever reason, white female teachers were notorious for telling the parents of Black and brown students that their kids couldn't keep up. My mom was an educator. And so she said, oh, well, thank you very much. We'll probably go get her tested. My mom wasn't dumb. She knew exactly what she was doing. And they got me tested. And turns out the second grade teacher was right. I didn't belong in that class. I belonged in the gifted and talented education. Yeah. So, early on, I've been always trying to be set aside and thought of as less than. In high school, I took a sewing class and the project was an apron. I made my prom dress and I got to be in the class. It wasn't because my prom dress wasn't good. It was because I didn't conform to the required apron. Shortly after that, when I was trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do, I told my parents I thought I wanted to try modeling. So they put me in modeling school and I went down to the local mall for a contest. I won first place. Come to find out that one of the other girls in the modeling school won second place. They made a big deal out of her and never mentioned the fact that I was in it. So because I was so used to being set aside As a young adult, I was very firm in, you're going to see me, you're going to hear me, you're not going to set me aside, I'm not going to let you. And so from that standpoint, I may not have liked myself 20 years ago because I would not have understood what was driving me to always make sure that you are not going to overlook me. But I love what you said about giving yourself and others grace. And that's something that I preached for the last 20 years. So you're asking me about the person I was 20 years ago. Maybe I wouldn't have liked her so much, but the person of the last 20 years is always preaching grace with myself and others. Because if I can't extend grace to myself to have what I call a lesson learned, because I'm huge in language. I don't like to use failures and mistakes. I like to use lessons learned, because in my research, I have discovered that when people use failure and mistake, literally, it's hard for them to move forward. But if they say, this didn't go quite as I had planned, but it's a lesson learned, it's easier to move forward. And part of moving forward is extending grace to yourself and others. So until we can extend grace to ourselves, we can't possibly extend grace to others, which goes back to what you said earlier about organizations are flawed because human beings are flawed. And part of that flaw is, if I can't forgive myself, I can't forgive Dr. Taylor. And if I can't forgive Dr. Taylor, we've got an organization of folks that aren't forgiving of one another, that are not assuming best intent. And that really inhibits the growth mindset and keeps us in the fixed mindset, back to your point.
Oh, absolutely. I think that that's a wonderful example of and I like what else you're saying about this. I think that often when we meet people, we also don't realize that we're also meeting people's trauma, right?
Yes.
We're meeting people's experiences. And
Yes.
to assume that everyone is on our same journey or at the same place that we're at. And
Yes.
you trigger something in someone by the way
Yes.
you do something, by a word that you use, and you don't realize the impact that that is happening. And in order to have an open conversation, especially in a workspace, it requires that you engage in vulnerability. And vulnerability is, one, really tough with ourselves. Like I don't think as a culture, as a country, like we're taught to be vulnerable, especially with people who we don't find in our safe space. Yeah. And I think the conversations around diversity and inclusion require a layer of vulnerability that I hope that we're able to get to. I hope with our next president we can find the spaces, because I really think that with President Trump, it was downplaying the presence, or even it was increasing trauma for a lot of folks. And then I think for other folks, it was reminding them of what they potentially had to lose. And I think that when we know that fear is an incredible persuasive motivator. Mm-hmm. That's really where a lot of people have been living. Even if people are supporting him, they're supporting him, I think, from a state of fear.
Yes. And what you just said about when we meet people, we also meet their trauma. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, Dr. Taylor, I don't even know. I mean, this conversation is just, wow, more than I could ever have anticipated. When you're talking about the fact that when we meet people, we also meet their trauma, I just had a mastermind session with a team of senior VPs at a company that is just beginning their diversity inclusion journey. And I always start with the leadership first, because unless the leadership is comfortable with these concepts, unless the leadership is comfortable having these discussions, there's no way that they can role model the sense of belonging that they say they want the rest of the organization to have. And privately, in my one-on-ones with all of these executives, they always talk about the lack of trust. It's a great team, but there's no trust. And they kept telling me, we really need you to push them in these conversations. I said, okay, I tell you what, yes, I'm the consultant. Yes, it's part of my role to facilitate these conversations, but it's also part of my role to role model how you need to bring these conversations to the fore and discuss them yourselves, because I'm not always going to be with the company. Oh. So I was so proud of the fact that they put themselves out there and talked about, this was my experience growing up as a Black person. This was my experience growing up as a Jewish female. This was my experience growing up as, an Italian guy. This was my experience growing up in a family with 5 sisters. And in my own family, I felt included, but I did not necessarily feel belonging. Yeah. And so based on their own personal stories, we're able to understand why this person always feels like they have to put walls up. We understand why this person is always defensive. We understand why this person is non-confrontational, but we need you to be involved in the decision-making process. And so to your point, we cannot possibly get there as an inclusive society unless we do recognize that people are bringing their own trauma, or as one of the executives said, head trash, right? That's part of how we show up. And to your point, Dr. Taylor, unless we're comfortable enough to be vulnerable to say, this is what has shaped who I am and how I show up, which means we need to give each other some grace and assume best intent as an organization, we're not going to get where we're trying to go.
No.
This conversation is so good. And you're bringing forward so many things that either I've not thought of, so thank you, or you're confirming the things that I'm trying to express to my executives in order to get to diversity inclusion. And it seems like there may be a limited view of diversity and inclusion that impacts organizations. So now tell us about that.
Yeah, this is also a really great point, and something that I think in order to get to that vulnerability, right, we have to broaden our sense of what does it mean to be diverse? What is a definition of diverse for our organization, our space, our group, whatever it might be. And I think a lot of times when people hear diversity, they think only race and ethnicity, because that's really what's being talked about most broadly in media, and like that's what people attribute it to. But if we start to expand our definition of diversity to think gender, sex, sexual orientation, experience, thought, where you grew up, right? Context matters in terms of diversity. All of those elements help to identify who we are, how we experience the world, how we listen to the world, how we respond to the world. And all of those, I think, have an important space in our abilities to be vulnerable and connect with people and or not. And I think in the same vein that we want everyone to be represented in policies, we also want our diversity to be represented in diversity. And then I think we're more willing to listen to diversity. So if I'm in a meeting and people are only talking about race and ethnicity as diversity, I'm probably going to get a little defensive because my white skin isn't represented in that space, where what's not also being told is, well, actually my family immigrated here, but that's not being told by my skin color. And so I'm going to get defensive and I'm going to pull away. Whereas we're going to talk about like familial experience as diversity and like those sorts of elements. I'm going to listen more openly. I'm going to be more of an effective listener. I'm going to contribute. And I think being seen, being heard in that way is also, I think it's just important to open it up for those reasons, because we start to establish, I like that word, belongingness, sort of sameness in ways that maybe we didn't first see. It's like, I see you, I read you, I think I know who you are, and I'm moving on. But we're so much more complex than that.
I agree with what you're saying about making sure that diversity also includes, again, these are words that I use all the time: diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of thought, diversity of approach, diversity of problem solving skills. That being said, we need to really balance what you're saying about diversity is not just what we look like, it's also what shapes us. But I think in some cases, people try to use that as a reason not to discuss diversity. For instance, well, I can have, 12 white people in a room and they all have diverse experiences of being white. Okay, I'll give you that. Or to say, well, I'm an Italian American and I'm a Jewish woman, my experiences are different. I'll give you that. But when I show up in a room, it's clear that I'm a Black woman. If you show up in a room, we may or may not know whether or not you're Italian. And unless you self-disclose, we don't have any reason to have a problem with you.
Yeah.
You show up in the room as a white woman. Number one, you're a woman, but number two, you're still white, which still gives you an advantage. And number three, even if you're a white Jewish woman, nobody's going to have a problem with your Jewishness unless you self-disclose. So we still have that dynamic going on. And believe me, I get what you're saying. We need to talk about diversity in terms of who we are and what shaped us. But when I walk into a room, I don't get that that initial
privilege.
Yeah, I don't get that initial privilege that you might. And I don't know what your background is.
Yeah.
So how do we balance that? Because I hear you. I often start off my conversations with, we need white people in this conversation. My approach is not to say this is the fault of white people, not at all. My approach is privilege happens to typically go to the white person, but that's not your fault either. That's the way the system was set up. So let's explore this. So to your point, how do we balance that and make sure that we're not in our efforts to be completely 100% inclusive? How do we make sure that we're still not forgetting why we're having these discussions, which is usually the experience of Black and Indigenous people of color and those in the LGBTQ community?
Yeah. This is a fabulous question. I'm like, in giving all of these things, I'm like, this is so my personality that I'm like, let's everyone hug and then let's just like pretend it's all going to be okay. I guess to your point, if I'm thinking about how does this then work in an actual work setting, is if you start with allowing people to see some of their variables or like opening up their minds, I think that they then don't come from a sense of defense. They come, like people can come from a little bit more of an open mind. But then just bringing it back to concepts of like systems, and these are the elements that are being talked about so specifically in terms of diversity, because these are the actual problem. Like this is the data, right? I can't wait to get back to a life where we actually believe in science and numbers.
Don't hold your breath, sweetie.
Like this is going to be so exciting. Logic is coming back to us. But I think maybe like ending it with like ending a conversation. I'm thinking if you were doing a consulting meeting, like starting with more open mindset, like asking people to be reflexive and vulnerable, but then like, here is why we're here, going back to race, ethnicity as like, you know, yes, absolutely. I walk into a space and people see me in a certain way. If I walk into a space with my husband who's African, people see us in a different way, right? And I recognize that. I recognize that through conversations that we lived in Utah for a little while, and I would always have white older men come up to me and they would say, "He is a very nice man," and I'm like, oh, thank you. What, like, how am I supposed to respond to that? Because what's underlying that is I didn't anticipate that from this body. And I want you to know, as a person of authority in society, that it's okay. And I'm like, I don't know you. But I do know my partner who, yes, does maybe challenge your expectations of what a 6'6" dark man is supposed to do, be, or you know, any of your expectancy violation, like totally violating any expectancies around that. So I don't know that I really answered. I don't know that there's one way to get at it, but I guess that's sort of my personality is let's invite people to a conversation and then defy their expectations.
So you having shared that lived experience brings me to another point that I'd like to make. First of all, I agree with you. It's all about conversation. I like to say that it's important to invite participation so that we can investigate perceptions and integrate perspectives. I think that should be the goal of conversations that matter. That being said, we cannot stop with a conversation. We need to drive conversations that convert to actions. Yeah. And so to your point about, you know, these older white men coming up to you and kind of validating your choice in a husband that doesn't look like what they would expect for you. To me, that's another sense of how I'm defining hidden organizations. The fact that people are cordial to your face, they're thinking something different. And if they have the guts, they'll tell you. And I know that when you and I were talking earlier this week, you shared another experience that I would definitely define as a hidden organization right there in your own neighborhood. Would you mind sharing that with our audience?
Yeah. So after I talked about this, then I was thinking, like, why did that bother me so much? So I have to be honest, before I moved to California, so my partner and I decided to leave Utah because we wanted a more diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, representation, area to live, because we're a mixed couple. And so we moved to New York, and then we were going to move here. And I have a friend who's from Southern California. She said, "Oh, you have to be very careful about where you choose." And I was like, what? You know, my understanding of California before coming here is like everyone's open. And so we had conversations about what communities might be more accepting of us being mixed. And And so then that then translates into what happened this weekend. So we were just on our way back from a walk with our dog, and we know that our neighbors are conservative. They've made comments, but they were on their way to a Trump rally with flags, and for some reason that those symbols just made it so much clearer to me that like they look at us in a different way. And then the next day I was out for another walk with the dog, and I saw one of the couples, and the husband he just kept walking past, like didn't stop. The wife stopped to say hi. And that moment, like it's broken me in a few ways, and I'm like still feeling like fairly emotional about it because I love where we live. But it just reminded me that there is a hierarchy, and there is this divisive discord that has been allowed to be present and is now more prevalent because it's been given permission to be. It's given, racist conversations have maybe been like more hidden or more covert, but now they're given power in new ways. And I would say because of President Trump's conversations around most things, it's like, yeah, this is the way you can talk about it. This is the way it's always been, or like these are those populations, or blah blah blah, whatever it might be. And so it hurts. It hurts in my hopeful, optimistic heart. It hurts. So how to go forward? I don't know.
Well, I have to say that your example that you just shared to me exemplifies what I'm defining as hidden organizations, because this was right in your neighborhood. Up until this present time, you were cordial with your neighbors. And then once they went to the Trump rally and showed their true colors, and, political affiliations aside, believe what you want, whatever. But when you saw the noticeable change in how they treated you, to me, that's a hidden organization, because their frame had always been like that. Their worldview had always been like that. But it was not until they went to the rally that you discovered, I am existing in a hidden organization in that sense. So that being the case, when we go into the workplace, recognizing that there are quote unquote hidden organizations, as you've just described, and as I'm defining it in the context of this particular conversation, where do relationships come into play? And before you answer that question, I will say again that in my work, I do not discuss race relations. I always focus on building relationships, because once we have relationships, I think the issues of race relations will either take care of themselves, or they're much easier to broach and discuss and work through if we have relationships. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, I love that idea of like the role of relationships and how relationships can allow us to have that new knowledge.
Yes.
But I also think, so as an organizational communication scholar, I think it's important to think about relationships in general in the workplace, because we spend more time with our colleagues than we often do with our families. And relationships meaning, is like there's some often like with our employer, like how do you navigate those interpersonally? What types of connections do you have? And studies show us that the more relationships or the more connected we feel to our organizations, the better rates of, the lower rates of turnover, the happier people are. And so these have been studies for eons. So it's important to consider that for happiness and productivity in the workplace, but then also our emotional space. And I like the idea. So I was thinking about, okay, so we have these relationships, we like maybe someone challenges our expectations of them, or they say something, I was thinking about an example of, where are you from? And what's really behind that question. And for me, those moments are an opportunity to engage in conversation. And, this, of course, is going to come down to each person, but I'd like to hopefully lead from a point of conversation. So for me, in that, if it were me, someone asked me that, I would say, thank you so much for being interested in me. I want to tell you how I heard that question. And I want to ask, is that really what you mean?
You
And
know, I got to pause you right there.
yeah,
Thank you for that, because I have been so busy in my work trying to make sure that other people are just uncomfortable enough to hear what needs to be said, but not so uncomfortable that they turn off.
uh-huh.
And what you just said is helpful, because it was like 10 minutes before a talk that I was about to do. And two of the women who brought me on, they said, "Oh, your eyes, you just look so exotic. Where are you from?" I said, "Riverside." These are two white women. "No, no, I mean, where are you from?" I said, "Riverside." "No, I mean, where are you from?" "What else do you want me to tell you? Do you want me to say that I'm from Jamaica?" "I'm sorry, but I'm not. I am the original California girl that's not seen on the posters. I was born and raised in Southern California." And I told them, as a teachable moment, you know, that made me feel like I didn't belong, because you couldn't believe that I came from Riverside. And I've heard from Asian Americans say, they get asked 3 or 4 times, "Where are you from?" "I'm from Ohio." "How many times do I have to say it?"
Right.
So you just gave me a wonderful way to approach that. Please say that again, because for other people of color who might get this because they look exotic,
Mhm.
how do we, I just love that response. So please share that again.
Yeah. So just essentially acknowledging the person's question. So thank you so much for being interested in me. Here's what I hear when you ask that question. So in your case, right, what I hear from you is that I don't belong here. What I hear from you is that America or California exists originally without my body or without people that looked like me. And that's like historically, like we know that this is not the case. Like most people who claim America, right, actually weren't original settlers here. So I think that that's also historically, we can again go back to data. It's so exciting. But I think in that way, it allows people to hear what they've said, right?
Yes, yes,
Here's what I've said to you. And then it also offers an opportunity for like you to stand up for, okay, I don't like the way that that question was asked. Here's how I heard your question. Are you interested in the origin of my family?
Mhm.
Or are you interested in where I was? Like, are you thinking I wasn't born here? Right. So allowing people to have an opportunity to reflect on their own questions and how they're being perceived communicatively. That's an important moment in a lot of conversations, but especially this one.
I want to dig, if I may, I want to dig a little deeper there, because we're talking about building relationships, and to build relationships, you ask people questions about themselves so that you get to know people on a different level. And to your point, work is more, because we do spend more time at work than we spend at home. This really is our first family, if you think about it, simply
Yeah,
by the amount of time that we spend at work.
yeah.
So that being said, Dr. Julie, how do we balance when it's okay and what types of questions are okay to ask, because we truly want to get to know someone without someone being offended? Because
Yeah.
this is something that's coming up a lot in my work, and they're saying, "Well, you want me to build relationships, but the way to build relationships to ask questions about people, but then you're telling me to ask questions about people others them, and I just don't know what to do."
That is, I hear that stressor. And the way that I always talk to my students about this is think about intention. And
Yes, managing intent with impact.
yes,
Yes,
and so, like your own intention, like if you go in out of genuine curiosity, people can read that. Like we are trained to read nonverbals very well, and
yes,
nonverbals including tone of voice.
yes,
Um, but and then also I think that like assuming good intention in first interaction for people is
yes,
really helpful for you to also be like, that felt a little wrong. I'm going to give it one more shot, maybe. And
yes,
then if it's not like a super aggressive question, giving it one more time. And then you can set those boundaries. I think boundaries are very healthy.
yes.
And you can decide, like, these are my talking points with this person. And sometimes boundaries include exiting. One of my favorite things around like boundaries in terms of communication is saying something like, it sounds like this conversation needs more time and I need to get back to what I was doing. And so, like, finding ways to exit yourself out of spaces that might escalate or feel like even more traumatic for you. So, always
Mm.
protecting yourself.
I think that's huge, to protect ourselves. So just like you gave us a formula for saying, "Thank you for being interested in me. This is how I heard that question." Is there a formula to go into a discussion, to your point, you can tell when someone's being curious versus nasty. We want to assume best intent. So just like you gave us a formula to help someone see how their question was not comfortable, is there a formula for us to be inquisitive, to be able to say, I'm really curious. My intention is to, may I ask this question? How do we go about that?
I like that idea. Like, my intention is to, or I'm just curious about. I also think, like, be very understanding of your own nonverbals. So when we lean in, like, we talk about this idea of leaning in, but like actually leaning in, it's showing like I'm interested in you. Having eye contact in U.S. American culture is a very significant way of saying like I'm inviting you to participate with me.
Mm-hmm.
I would say smiling, but I don't necessarily mean just smiling, because I think that there's a lot of consequences, racially, gender, sex, right? For like, my assumption is that you should be smiling all of the time, but you can smile with your eyes, with your eyebrows, and just allowing people to see the openness.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also think being honest in your conversation. So for instance, I have a student in my class who identifies as trans. And one day after class, I just asked them to stay after. And I said, listen, I want to make sure that every voice is represented in my classroom. And I want to know, what am I maybe unintentionally doing in my syllabus that makes you not see yourself? And what could I do better? And this student just said, they said, I'm blown away. No one's ever asked me that. But here are some ideas. And I was super nervous because I, one, didn't want this person to feel like I was tokenizing them or making them share their experience for all experiences. But I was like, here is my goal. My goal is that when people come into my class, they see it as a safe space from like first read of my course. And I want that to be the feeling throughout. So here's my hopes in this conversation. And if you're not comfortable or you don't want to talk about it, you can walk away. And so I think that being honest in those first moments, like I'm really genuinely curious, can you tell me about this, is helpful to be honest about your own intentionality.
I think that is some sound advice. I am thrilled with what I have learned. I'm thrilled with what you have shared. I'm excited that we've had an opportunity to exchange experiences that reinforce the dialogue that we're having this morning. I cannot believe how quickly the time has flown. It's been a great investment of time. Thank you so much. This month's theme was surviving the scene, what we have seen in terms of how people are showing up, and surveying the scene, the SCENE, or the landscape within which we now find ourselves situated and have to move forward. So we talked about what I have defined as a hidden organization, and you have explained to us that on a micro level that might be the case, but on the macro level, we're talking about things such as human trafficking and those types of hidden organizations. We talked about our own lived experiences with people and how, the hidden organizations have popped up, you and your neighborhood and the neighbors that you're seeing, and your interactions were one way and now they're a different way. And now you're seeing there's this like hidden, subset of the neighborhood. We talked about the growth versus the fixed mindset and how we show up, and the fact that when we show up with people, we're showing up with our trauma. And unless we get to know people, it's hard to assume best intent, because we are experiencing people not as the world sees, but as we see. And that's only fair. We can only experience based on our own perception, but that doesn't mean that we can't expand the possibilities of our perception, which goes to the growth versus the fixed mindset. And then the limited view of diversity and how that impacts organizations. And that while diversity inclusion was originally about how I show up and making me feel comfortable, it also goes to diversity of background and thought and approach. But let's not go too far to the left and forget why we're here. So we need to be inclusive even in the way we approach diversity. And then finally talking about relationships and the importance of relationships, and that there's still that fine line between asking out of curiosity and asking in a way that might make someone feel othered. Yep. And that it's absolutely okay and probably advisable to say, this is the intention behind what I'm about to say, or something to that effect. Are there any other pearls of wisdom that you want to share with us, Dr. Julie, before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon?
Oh, I think the last thing as a communication scholar, I have to just say, focusing on our communication and realizing that every instance is communicative. And I think back to one of your original questions was about microaggressions.
Mm.
And I like to think about microaggressions as microexpressions. And what we know in nonverbal communication, so when we think verbal versus nonverbal, our nonverbal expressions are microexpressions. They're the ones that we read and we put a lot of stake into those. People have more time to think about what they're going to say. So if there's a contradiction, we focus on the nonverbal and we say, that's the one I'm reading, right? And so if we think about micro expressions and microaggressions, that question of, is that what I really heard? I think yes. Go with your gut. You can dig into it a little deeper if you feel comfortable in the conversation and engaging, but also don't be afraid to trust yourself and say, this is not a safe space for me, and set those boundaries.
Now, how do we distinguish between what you just said and falling into the suggestion that we're being overly sensitive?
Yeah. I think that just asking, right? Like you can say, like, this is what I heard. It allows the person to maybe say, like, that's not what I meant, but here's what I meant. Or if that person just gets completely defensive and is like, oh, you're too sensitive.
Then you kind of know you're reading it right.
Yeah, because if a person didn't mean it that way, they're going to be more open to the opportunity of being personally reflexive and having an educational moment. If people get defensive, I often think there's your answer.
Dr. Julie Taylor, it has been an honor to have you on the show. Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Cal State University, San Bernardino. Community, this will not be the last time that we have a conversation, a real conversation with Dr. Julie Taylor. Dr. Julie, thank you so much for joining me. I want to remind our community, please subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the YouTube channel at Dr. Anita PhD, spell it out, DoctoRanita PhD. And until the next time, remember to stay blessed and keep it real.